Welcome to the Conscious Combat Club, trauma-informed martial arts by women for women. I'm your host Georgia, and I cannot wait to go on this journey with you. Please note that some listeners might find this content distressing. Take care, connect with your support networks, and refer to the organisations in the show notes below. Today on the podcast, I chat with Emily Dobrich, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Toronto, exploring how embodied learning practices in Muay Thai support women in self-determination. In this conversation, we deep dive into embodiment and embodied learning in martial arts, how to cultivate self-determination, aka choice, in martial arts, and how being in community makes all this possible. Emily and I met because we are co-panelists at the Martial Arts Studies Conference in Cardiff in June, where we'll be yarning about gender and martial arts. So best believe we geek out about gender performance in martial arts and barriers for women to participate in Muay Thai. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Emily, let's kick off talking about embodied learning. What does the term embodied learning mean, and what does it mean in the context of martial arts?
Awesome. Thanks, Georgia. Well, so excited. One of my favorite topics and the focus of my research, for sure. So happy to share my thoughts on embodied learning. So the first thing when I think of embodied learning is, just to sort of contextualize it, is that it's very broad, diverse. There's many different theories for sure of like understanding embodied learning, embodiment. And so for me, when I think of embodied learning, essentially comes down to looking at learning as a whole person activity, a total body experience. So looking at the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual dimensions of learning and how those interact, evolve, shape our learning experiences, and how those dimensions sort of work together to create a more holistic, comprehensive, deeper learning experience. It's very liberating in a sense. It really opens us up to so many more possibilities for learning, growth, transformation. When you think of the different dynamics and dimensions and how they work together to shape our learning experiences. And sometimes even that can be fully challenging to put into words, right? Because how do we like really verbalize like what this is if it felt like deep sort of level? One of the most significant things I think to me is that it really helps connect on a deeper level with ourselves and also with each other and our environment and our experiences. I've learned a lot about embodied learning since I started my PhD work, actually, from Indigenous perspectives on embodiment and embodied learning. Specifically from my supervisor, who's like an expert in Indigenous knowledge. She's really helped sort of guide my journey and my understanding to look at embodiment as sort of that experience, that interaction of body, spirit, as well as land and environment. So really thinking about all these different, again, contextual factors as well.
Yeah. And from a research perspective, this is fascinating, right? So from a sort of motor learning and skill development perspective, we talk about the difference between learning and performance. So performance being, you could do the thing, whether that's a technique on a given day in a certain set of conditions where you had maybe like a lot of external coaching, versus learning being something that's repeatable over time, endures within different contexts. So, if you're in a different dojo or you're in a competition versus in training, or there's been a significant amount of time passed since somebody showed it to you and then you copied it, that meaning learning. Then when we add the embodied perspective, how do we measure that? How do we talk about that in terms of research if something's been learned versus the learning has been embodied?
Oh my gosh, such a great question and really fascinating to think about it. I think we're still sort of even trying to figure that out in research itself, like how to understand like embodied learning and how do we research embodied learning. But from my own perspective, you have to learn like through your body and be able to be comfortable with kind of getting in tune with your body in that experience for sure. I think being submerged in the actual like learning context is like so important to be able to do that research. Like it's one thing to maybe like write about and talk about it. You actually have to bring your body like to learn and to really be able to understand understand it and be able to bring that across as a researcher. So it does definitely require, I think, going deep. And that's what I found even doing my research was just like how much, I mean, this kind of research takes out of you at an embodied level. Again, all these different dimensions, like I mentioned, like at the body, the physical level, but also, you know, emotional level, as well as your mental level as well. Like it all really, yeah, just take a lot out of you. But it's so cool and fascinating to get into that.
Yeah. And if we flip that, if someone's a coach and they're thinking like, well, yes, definitely, this is something that's very interesting. How do I facilitate classes that are going to lead to more embodied types of learning? What would be some of the differences between the coaching styles?
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely, you've got to be very open and aware, and just being aware of your participants, or you know who you're training, and just being able to meet them as well and meet them where they're at. Yeah, embodied facilitation is really it requires a lot of awareness, I think, as well, and just really being able to connect with people at an embodied level. Again, it comes back to connection. I think connection is such a crucial way of thinking about this, and looking for connection. And I think giving space as well, giving that space for that connection to build, and even being, I think, a little bit vulnerable too, being as a coach, as well as being able to trust your participant as well, and just to let them have that space. And that's the thing too, where like giving participants or trainees some of their own agency or self-determination over the learning experience can really help build that connection, because again, it's not just you sort of like trying to force somebody to go into like this experience. You got to give them space to grow and to learn in the process as well, and have that kind of engagement.
This is just like trauma-informed practice.
Which I know you love, so yeah.
I mean, two things really stuck out to me there. The first is having that vulnerability as a facilitator to see what is your experience. And tangibly in practice, what I like to do is I'll give kind of a running commentary on what I'm noticing within my body, because I think it's difficult for participants to imagine what that looks like for them without having a model, but it also helps put me into more of this like childlike, really curious mind that I think can be contagious within the group. So for example, I might say like, oh, I'm noticing that my left kick is feeling quite a bit more restricted than my right today. Or I might say, you know, like I'm noticing that there's some fatigue coming up for me in my left shoulder. And I think it's really cool also to add it into like, oh, I can actually adjust my technique if I, you know, connect to this part of my body and do this thing differently, because we're all on a continuous learning journey, right? There's no duration of practice of martial arts where I think you are like done. And that's one of the really cool things about it. It's a consistent refining process. So tapping into the body and seeing what that looks like, and then modeling that back to clients. And then the self-determination, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, but really that invitational language, giving clients the ability to use their own exploration to figure out how the movements work. We know from a motor learning perspective is both going to help them learn. Over time, they're going to remember things they worked out versus things that they were told. Yeah, and how that connects to the body, and the body really being like at the center of all of that. I absolutely love. I'm so glad that you're going to be publishing research on this, because this is something we talk a lot about in like our grant applications and things like that. So we can say like, oh yes, and there's research showing how this relates to Muay Thai, which is just absolutely wild that it's Muay Thai of all the martial arts. So yeah, let's go to self-determination. What is self-determination, first of all, for folks who have never heard that term before?
Yeah, so for me, self-determination is really about sort of having that voice and that inner knowledge, and having sort of an agency and an engagement, being able to sort of direct your own experience. So your learning experience. So having that determination of kind of where things are going, having that real connection, engagement to be able to guide the process, and sort of getting what you need out of that learning experience. I think it's super important to really prioritize learning self-determination as like a coach or a facilitator, because that can really impact the learner's experience, the outcome of their experience, especially in martial arts too. especially for women entering a martial arts space, there could be some sort of like fear and intimidation of going into that space. So being able to have that self-determination to engage how they need to and get what they need from the space is really important. And sort of helps that consensual engagement. So really helping people hook into the experience, right? And so, yeah, and I mean, part of that involves like trust and relationship building. There's all the different dimensions that can really help and support building that.
Oh, I love those dimensions. Okay, so for self-determination, which if that's a big mouthful of a term, maybe just choice, is helpful for folks to kind of conflate. One aspect you just mentioned is trust. So building trust. What are the other dimensions of self-determination?
Yeah, I think sort of having sort of self-awareness is really important of yourself and kind of what your goals and your needs are. So having that sort of consciousness as well, and self-acceptance. And also I think sometimes when we say self-determination, we think that's just like an individual kind of thing, but realizing that it also can come from, you also need some sort of like social support and community support as well. And even how systems can sort of shape and be determinantal of that. So if you think of it like in a martial arts context as well, when you think about the gym and the gym space, and how the coaching like language or environment like that all can sort of help create the space and the conditions for learning to support self-determination. So yeah.
Yes, and I love the self-awareness part of that, because I think it's so common in martial arts for the pathway to be for someone to go from training to competing, having some time spent competing, and then either injury or age, they decide to switch into coaching. And it's not a very conscious decision. It's not something that they spend a lot of time thinking about. I've been in what I would call the selfish fighter mode, which all active fighters are. You kind of need to be in order to do well in a sport that demands just so much of you. To selfless mode to an extent where you're really focusing much more externally on other people, but still needing to have, like you say, that self-awareness of what am I bringing into the space? Am I frustrated at something else that happened during the day? And am I bringing that into the gym? And everyone's probably heard of a coach where the group will be whispering amongst themselves saying like, oh, be careful, they're in a bad mood today. Like you never want to be that coach. And I don't think anyone does that intentionally, but a lot of people do, right? So how do we make sure that we are transitioning from a space into a space where we're teaching? How do we go from outside of the gym in our day-to-day lives into the gym where we're trying to create a space where people can have self-determination? Because they can't, if they are in survival mode, where we're not looking after ourselves first. And I think what I see the other end of that sometimes being with people who want to do more impact-based work, more trauma-informed work, they are oftentimes survivors themselves, and they haven't gotten to the point where they're ready to track everybody else's emotional, energetic, spiritual needs in the space, because they're just trying to stay in their own window of tolerance. And then they don't yet have the capacity to be able to manage the group. So it's fascinating thinking about that. And I think maybe the one that gets forgotten.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. It can be so easy to forget those things.
How did you get to understand about this? What did you do, or what have you been doing in your research? I know you're still doing your PhD. So yeah, I'd love for you to share with everyone what does that experience look like? How have you been collecting data? How are you analyzing it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so my interest in like studying women's embodied learning experience in martial arts, I've been doing martial arts since I was 6. So it's a couple decades now. And it's always been like a really big part of my life and experience. So I've been coaching for a while now, and it was just, sort of that experience of coaching and observing and seeing, just really, really fascinated by different people's embodied experiences and seeing that transformation at the individual as well as the group and collective level. So that's really kind of what brought me to do this work, and really just an interest to learn more and to share that and to research it. So that's kind of really interesting. And then, of course, like looking out through an embodied lens and looking at the idea of embodied learning just makes so much sense to really understand like the depth and complexity of like what's actually happening. Because, you know, you're in that space, like you say, you're in that space and you observe things and you're like, I see things going on here, but like, what is it? What's going on? And like, how do we study it? So yeah, so for my research, I organized a training collective with women to novice women learners to learn martial arts, Muay Thai, as you mentioned, that's kind of my martial arts. And so, yeah, we did some sessions together. I did some interviews with participants. So one-on-one semi-structured interviews to ask them about their experiences and sort of what they got out of it. And I've also with that, I also do what's called like an embodied ethnography. So that means me as like the researcher, the facilitator, like being in the space and just, again, as you were saying before, just being, you were mentioning that as a coach, right? Like you're kind of thinking what's going on in my body, what's happening here in that space. So that's me sort of like tuning into sort of the group dynamics and what's going on. And then just reflecting on that and sort of observing, I think more as like witnessing more than just particularly just observing. Like witnessing is like a much deeper, more embodied methods. So you're actually like sort of being aware of your body, your own emotions, things going on in the space, just being aware of that sentient, like all the senses involved, and just really being aware of that. So it takes a lot of sort of like practice and sort of attention and different ways of thinking and feeling and observing, and then trying to kind of write it all down as best you can in words afterwards.
Yes. And then how does that get presented as an ethnography? I think I've only ever read like ethnographic books, not necessarily papers. It feels like it would be hard to get all of that. Like it's so much rich information into a paper. Of course, a PhD dissertation is basically a book, right? But yeah, how do you distill all of that? Is it kind of like storytelling? Is the data presented as figures? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, I'm still writing up the results and the findings of the dissertation. But yeah, in terms of field notes, yeah, just writing it all down as much as possible. Yeah, just being really, really clear and vivid and rich. It's very rich qualitative data for sure. And just again, like writing everything I possibly can. And then once you think I've got enough, like how much more can I write? And then of course you gotta have to like sift through it all and like see what kind of makes sense and like how does that make sense? And really there's a lot of reflexivity involved as well. So like going through it again and like looking through it all and then trying to make further sense of it.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. I'm so excited to read this work and of course to hear more about it on the panel that we'll be speaking at soon. So for those who aren't aware, I'm sure no listeners are aware because it's not as if the Martial Arts Studies Conference is very like mainstream even in the martial arts world, which is quite surprising. I do think we're speaking on a panel about gender and martial arts, and of course your work has looked specifically at women. So maybe we start out by, this might be an obvious question, but I want to ask it anyway. Why women? Why study women's embodied learning as opposed to everybody's embodied learning?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, gender issues are like prevalent in different kinds of spaces, but I think especially in martial arts, they're very sort of they're more sort of like typically thought of as more like masculinized spaces. And I think women finding like creating their space and understanding space is really sort of important. There's definitely a lot of gender issues and gender power dynamics that sort of like have come to play. And I think there's something too about women coming together to learn martial arts as well. I mean, even my experience like facilitating and teaching and coaching, like there's always been something different there. And I think that there's definitely a need for more research, and because different experiences, gender is so diverse and there's so many issues involved in different contexts, understanding how different contexts and pedagogy shape it. So there's definitely a need for more understanding of that and more research that is coming up. It's great to see. I know when I started out, even in my research in the last couple of years, it's been great to see that different papers and different research coming out, because recognizing, comparing and contrasting gender performance and experiences in different martial arts, I think is really important, because different martial arts will have different experiences as well as different contexts. And that just helps us understand better, like kind of what's going on, the more that we talk about and support each other and like research and discuss, and recognizing again that like no one size fits all in terms of martial arts.
Yeah, so fascinating. Recently we submitted a grant through the Australian government, and they collect research on sport participation here in Australia. And for martial arts participation, they combine a huge number of martial arts. So they essentially separate out jiu-jitsu, they separate out wrestling, but then they conflate all other martial arts. So boxing, kickboxing, tai chi, like Wing Chun. Yeah, so they conflate soft martial arts and the hard martial arts, and then look at gendered participation, then said it's pretty 50-50 actually. And if you drill into the data, you can see there's a huge portion of the population of women over 65 who participate in this like category of martial arts, which I can only assume is their participation in more like the soft styles of martial arts. And I've asked for the raw data and nobody's willing to give it to me yet, which is very poor by the Australian government. Or they're just slow, maybe. Maybe it's just the kind of thing that'll take them 3 months to be able to deliver us the actual raw data that they collected, because my hunch is that that's the reason why they don't actually show that was the skew. But yeah, how does the different types of martial arts in research, and I suppose you've looked at a hard style of martial art, right, where I think the performances of masculinity are dialed up much higher than they are in things like push hands and tai chi and more the moving meditation styles of martial arts. Have you seen much research looking at more of the soft styles, or is it more coming out about the hard styles?
Well, I guess because of my research interest, that's the ones that my literature searches have come up for sure. Yeah.
And in terms of this idea around gendered performance, I think something that really captivates me is whether or not it is do women need to perform as men in order to exist in combat sports spaces? Or have we just assumed that is a necessity because they are masculine dominated spaces? Typically, majority of participants are men, and so women are needing to do some sort of masking in order to participate. Some women, of course, the gender's such a spectrum, but so we're going to generalize. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think from what I've done some of the research, there is a certain sort of mixed context, maybe excitement or a different, like sort of that gender performance and blurring the lines and being more like dominant, because definitely sports in general sort of typified as more like, dominant, aggressive in a sense, and there can be some sort of excitement that comes out of that. But I don't think necessarily in my research study in particular, which was, of course, just a women's only context. I mean, I think it's interesting because participants did think that they thought that because it was a women's only space, it was definitely a different like environment and energy that was created. There's a certain level more of empathy, Carrie, you can sort of open up and be more vulnerable, and that creates more connection. So I think it does make a difference if you look at women's only versus sort of a mixed gender spaces. But I think there is a certain sort of similarity maybe in terms of like the strength and the body, the confidence that you can build in those spaces. But again, everyone's going to be different in those kind of dynamics.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting to then come back and think about that in terms of learning, right? It's like we spoke about towards the beginning of this conversation, how can people really engage in embodied learning if they are either in protection mode, so protecting themselves from the coach or maybe other participants, versus really being safe enough to tap into their body, noticing what their body's asking for, make requests that are aligned to that state, and explore movements, be curious about movements. And you can't do any of those things when you're in survival mode.
Absolutely. I totally, like we just mentioned about like exploring the movement and sort of, again, it goes back to the idea of having that space and to engage in sort of the embodied learning and become in tune. I think that's too what martial arts do. The embodiment of martial arts, it brings you in tune, right? It brings in tune, it sort of creates that balance between sort of the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So when you get that balance right, you sort of get that energy going and that curiosity to explore and to profit from the experience and the learning.
It's fascinating, right? Because what comes to mind when you're saying that is it's almost like a form of a flow state where it's not flow, right? We talk about flow, we're expressing learned movements already. We're not in a learning state, but there's this other quality of martial arts that helps us tap into like a sustained curiosity, like a period of time where you're so engrossed in exploration that we're no longer having our mind exploring past or future thoughts, right? We're very embodied during that period of time.
Exactly.
But it's not embodiment to the level of flow, we're we're no longer thinking about the movements because we're deeply thinking about the movements and seeing how we want to change them.
Yeah. And I think it's really cool you mentioned that about deeply thinking of the movement, because I think that's something very unique and special about martial arts, is because the movement patterns, they can be so like complex and varied, and they take a lot of focus and coordination, and sort of that continual practice of really, again, being really in tune with your body, how your body's moving. Like little tiny tweaks will change things, like even, you know, the angle of the kick or like the twist of your wrist and like the punch or like how, yeah. So I think it's a very incredible sort of embodied learning experience when you think about what martial arts really do and what that kind of activates in us and what is required as part of the learning process. But really fascinating.
Right. And it's not just in one dimension either, where you can continuously refine a movement without any external change to that movement. So for example, that's where I think the soft martial arts, it's in some ways one dimensional, because without practicing ever with a partner, and some people never do, right, those movements are going to be quite consistent over time. Maybe you're technically in a different room environment, but there isn't a target that is moving while you're also moving. And so we think about, you know, refining a movement in the context of shadow boxing, practicing it totally solo, then applying it to pad work, and then applying it to pad work within combinations. And I love this distinction for clients, because I think sometimes we have this idea that it's like the way that I practice one technique in isolation, like how good my cross is when I'm practicing just the cross versus how good my cross is in a combination of 7 other techniques is going to be different. But the skill of being able to chain together movements is going to be a different skill than just practicing one thing at a time. And you want to have a blending of both. And then of course sparring is like a whole other very elevated level that I would almost place on its total own place, because again, a lot of people never progress to sparring and don't really have a need to, because they're immersed enough in just how complex it is to learn to work with pads. Because even your partner will sometimes step, you know, they'll be a little bit further away, or they'll be a little bit closer, or this person holds pads differently to this other person, and, you know, taking the distance setting as being your responsibility as the person who's striking, and also the amount that you can learn from holding pads. Yeah, there's so many layers to that when we're doing a sport that is responsive to something else. And of course there are non-combat sports that have that element as well too, but maybe not with as many complex techniques, would be my biased assumption.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that idea of pad work. I think it's so fascinating as like an embodied activity when you think about it, because again, like you say, it takes that embodied experience to a whole nother level, because you have that working with a partner and that sort of energy transfer. And it just really does bring a whole nother sort of dimension of learning, because it is an embodied experience, but it's not just you. Again, you're working with the body of another person. And yeah, and again, then that opens up a whole nother thing of like collaboration, trust, even sometimes like vulnerability in terms of like being able to trust or somebody else. So that creates another dimension of learning to the experience.
I'm curious about the gendered perspective of this in terms of what in my experience and in a lot of the research that I've read is very common, is that typically women and gender diverse people who step into combat sports spaces, who want to take part in a sport like Muay Thai, often have a traumatic motivation for doing so. They've often had experiences of violence, which are the reason why they want to take back their power. They want to be able to do those movements they were unable to do. They want to develop a different relationship with quote unquote violence, because of course we know that, you know, if martial arts were violent, they would be lacking in consent. But I think that's a lot of people's their personal perspective when they come into these spaces is, I want to see how I can release anger, step into these movements, take on the embodied experience of the masculine energy instead of the submissive or scared energy that a lot of people are holding through the world. It's interesting in terms of embodied learning, though, because that experience can often disconnect people from their bodies. So I'm wondering if you picked up that in your research at all, whether people had difficulty, especially in the beginning, connecting to their bodies and connecting to their bodies, and how that impacted their ability to learn.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And from my perspective, is like seeing how the group sort of progressed throughout the sessions. I think I really noticed that people got more comfortable and more aware of their bodies throughout. I think they actually experienced a deeper connection to their bodies. And that came through the interviews as well, as people did mention that they noticed they became more connected to their bodies. They started thinking about their bodies more. There was a definite observation of the connection between mind and body in the learning process. And that became really, really important. That's a really strong theme that came through. And that just continued to build throughout. And even just being like observing people and watching and like helping with technique, I really noticed people sort of get more confident and more comfortable in their bodies and with the movement patterns. And it was really cool to watch that transformation go through, because from session 1 to the end of the project. So that was really cool to see that embodied learning take place. So I actually think they got more connected to their bodies. And it was interesting because I actually had a couple of participants mention how they didn't realize that they needed this, and that they are missing that connection to their body, and that they're missing like working out, being active and physically active. And so that was kind of a learning moment in itself. And I guess, you know, played into the embodied learning of how that was something that had been lacking and missing. And that this project really reminded them of the importance of that.
It's the coolest thing, I think, about one of the coolest things, I couldn't maybe pick one, about martial arts training is, in particularly when there's an embodied focus, where there's invitation to connect to body and notice how that's changing over time. And interviewing people afterwards would be such a great way to also invite this kind of consistent reflection on how is my connection to my body, because you're right, like often people don't realize how disconnected they are because they don't have another frame of reference. They only live in their bodies. They don't know how anybody else lives in their body. And so when we're talking about having this really detailed, what I call blueprint of where your body is in the world. So if you imagine like one of those 3D computer models that's kind of like spinning around, I think for a lot of people, it's kind of a blob. It's maybe like arm, leg, torso. Sometimes even whole sections of that are just missing. They're not considered. And the more you practice martial arts, because you've got to refine movements, just the slight angle change of the hip or the shoulder, or you know, the difference in the way that you're transferring your weight from your left foot to your right foot, this also builds up so much more detail. It's almost like we're adding more and more pixels to that blueprint that we're starting to look at. And the difference between that really detailed blueprint of where your body is versus that starting point can be quite stark. Of course, you don't realize it until you've first got it. Yeah, it's been a really interesting aspect of my work, has been recognizing how common body disconnection totally is. And I find really helpful to frame to people as a skill on the same kind of level as learning a jab or a cross or a roundhouse kick, that we're going to learn how to connect to our body. That is a skill, and it is a skill that is actually very much impacted by your previous experiences of safety. And if you've not had a lot of experiences of safety, it's going to be more difficult to practice that skill, but it's a skill that's going to get better with repetition nonetheless.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I love that moment too when I'm coaching, when you see somebody like that connection happen, especially when you're throwing, like you say, the roundhouse kick, you'll see it when like the hip, the shoulder, the leg, but it all sort of like comes together and people sort of just are able to go into that. That's one of my favorite things to see happen. And then look on people's face and like, oh my gosh, I did that. And they recognize that connection, that flow. Yeah, super cool.
What are some of the barriers that women face in martial arts? I think this is probably going to be very much a theme of the panel that we're on, and is really highlighted in Alex's paper about gender, which I think we've spoken about on this podcast. I'll link it. Is that, yes, martial arts can be this hugely transformative experience for women, but you have to get them through the door and get them consistently coming, and that's a difficulty. So was that discussed within your research? And also, like, what else do you think about barriers that women experience to participation?
Yeah, I think sort of there's the intimidation factor too, going to maybe entering into the space and sort of like worrying about how challenging it'll be, for sure. I think the thing too that came out as well in my research was wondering if you can do it. The question of can I do it? One of the things I loved in sort of the follow-up conversation with my participants was this the surprise, like that I can do it. Like I can do it was like the one of the things that surprised them. Because I mean, there's that question of like, I'm a woman, but I'm coming into this sort of like martial arts. Like, am I gonna be able to do it or not? Like, and then the realization that you can do it, it gives such confidence. It was great to hear that. So I think there is sort of that sort of concern about being able to do it. Another barrier, which I think a lot of them face, is time. Finding the time as well, especially when you think of sort of like gender norms in society, of how busy women are. If you're taking care of a family, if you got to go to work or school, and just all the other things that women can be expected to do. I mean, that can make it challenging actually just to get to the door, get in the space. So there's like subtle pressures on that. Even maybe like expectations too as well, and then just concerns of like kind of what will happen. And that, I think, not knowing as well, like what to expect, can be challenging. I think community support is like super, super important for helping people with consistency, in terms of finding that community and support, to give you, again, the confidence to be able to engage and to stay committed and connected. Just makes such a difference as well.
The time barrier comes up a lot. I know in Australian research, it's the #1 barrier that women experience to participating in sport. Is it something that you intentionally addressed?
So not specifically in my research project. I kind of had, it was a set time limit. I mean, the thing too is that the project was a set limit of time. Like we had so many sessions, and because you're a research participant, you kind of committed to sort of go through the project kind of thing. So there was a certain level of commitment that participants did make in order to like join the project. So that helped for sure with probably helping people stay committed and connected. So it wasn't actually something, but it would be something I'd be really interested to explore for sure in future research, is like, how do we address this challenge of time, and finding the time to get to training, get to class and everything.
Yeah. And also, is there like a positive version of that? Like, it takes me back to the work that we did in El Salvador, working with women there, where one of the things that we did in order to reduce the time barrier was inviting children into the space. So we had women bringing their kids along. Well, we also had one comment that is just like so stuck in my mind, where a woman said that she has to clean the whole, she cleans the house like every day. She has a lot of household chores that are involved in her day-to-day life. And that she knew she had to get them done to be able to come to our sort of just after lunchtime kind of midday class, and how that positively impacted her morning, because she had this extra like motivation to get her chores done so that she would be free to be able to come to the kickboxing class. And I haven't got like a, therefore the way we should structure classes is like this, but it's just something that's very interesting to, potentially reflect on, is the way that things like participating in organized sport kind of bookend our lives. I think about myself in my participation. I'll do things like cook food on a Sunday so that I can just get it out of the freezer or the fridge throughout the week, and therefore I am able to attend training an extra time. I don't have to go home and do things like that, and structuring my, how we look at structuring our time, which of course there's a lot of privilege attached to that, and not everybody can do that. And so we always want to hold that as well. But just, I don't have a fully formed answer to this, but this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, because it's a big question that I think societies want to address. At least I know that our government wants to address. I would assume the Canadian government wants to address, like, how do we ensure that women have the time to be able to participate in sport? Because it's not the number one barrier. I would have thought the number one barrier would be finances, but time is the number one barrier to people's participation. So we can offer all the free programs in the world, but if people can't get there, then what's the point?
For sure. And again, it goes back to sort of a societal, sort of community based development work that needs to happen, for sure, at a very structural, systemic level. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. And also when we think about it from more of our decolonial lens as well, what do you think about that? Because what comes to mind for me is, like, if we were not so individualistic as a society, where I have to look after my household, but if there was more, collective work, where maybe, for example, for, our few houses, I'll do big batch cooking, but you'll come and, you'll help with this, or you'll take the kids for this time. And as a collective, then how can we make it so that we can, it seems like such a small thing. How can
we
care so that we could do martial arts? But that could fill, that could be an X where you could fill in whatever blank. But of course, our lens is, how do we get people on that?
Yeah, definitely. It is a community collective effort, for sure. And I think that's sort of like the missing piece is really going to help make a difference. And yeah, for sure. But again, moving from the individual collective, but still having that sort of trying to find that balance and shift is definitely a work for the future.
Yeah, well, for sure. I'm curious how partnered work will play into that as well too, because it's a space where I think a lot of people get to try on the fact that it's not just your training, right? Particularly when we're not working on heavy bags, when we're working on pads, it also becomes, how do I look after the person in front of me? The intensity they want to work to, the intensity that I want to work to is modulated by what the other person's consenting to. And we're making sure that we're actually gaining that, throughout the class. We're asking people, am I going too hard? Do you want me to go harder, etc. When we have really open dialogue about that, you realize there's so many people with different needs within a space. So it becomes a little bit more of like, how do we look after the collective and community based in the session? So I don't know how that spills over into real life, but maybe it's like people have a bit of a model for it, and so then it becomes something that we have almost like group conversations about. Did you notice this here? How might you apply this elsewhere? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it creates a sort of conscious awareness of another person, which is so important. I mean, how much do we think of other people? And I think definitely that kind of partner, especially when I in partner pad work, like, again, prioritizing communication, like always, like, communicating with your partner is really important. I love when partners in pad works, if somebody's struggling with the technique, then usually the other partner will, like, we'll slow it down, they'll do it together. Like, again, there's that sort of like give and take, and that interaction, again, that really creating that sort of understanding and mutuality and reciprocity in the interaction, which I think it does like transfer over. It just gives you a sort of different awareness in that space. And again, it's something that you embody, right? Like, it's not just like we're watching, like, we're reading this book and like sort of thinking, you're actually like experiencing this at such a deep level. And so I absolutely think that it will transfer over into different relationships in different contexts, and it can, for sure.
Oh, what an exciting time to be alive in some capacity. I'm a forever optimist. I love being like, oh,
Yeah.
we
Oh,
just had
good. Me
this
too.
beautiful time in some ways, as much as if you turn on the news, it'll tell you the opposite. But I look around the spaces that we get to occupy and I'm just like, man, there's cool people doing such cool work. And like, nah, this is the exciting time, I think, the
Sure.
reckoning. What about you? So you mentioned before you started training in martial arts when you were 6. I'm not sure if you can remember why you started, being that you were 6, but what got you into it? What kept you into it? What's been your journey through the martial arts?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm always interested in like what people brought people to martial arts. So yeah, thanks for asking that question. So actually, my friends started doing it. It was so it was social. It was a social draw. My best friend started doing it, so I enrolled in as well. That was in karate actually. That was my first martial art. And so I did that for many years. I've done some boxing throughout, and it was just there was something about that. Again, it goes back to that embodied learning experience. The energy, the the connection and just the feeling that it really evokes and how it made me feel my body, which is something that kept drawing me in. So I tried different martial arts, did a little boxing, and then I found Muay Thai a little over half a decade ago. So that's been I've hooked into that ever since, and just really enjoyed exploring that, becoming a coach and running my own classes, and now doing my own research into martial arts. So it's kind of always been there and a part of me, and just really been an amazing journey, which I'm excited to continue.
And one question I ask most of my guests is, why do you think it is that martial arts have such a potent impact on people's lives, really? So you'll often hear things along the lines of, Muay Thai saved my life, and
Yes.
I think that a lot of times people mean Muay Thai changed my life when they say that, but sometimes they don't. But why do you think that there is such this strong sentiment within people who find quote unquote martial arts?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to embodiment and embodied learning. I mean, that's really what really creates that sort of, again, that deep learning. And it's, I think, a lot the emotional hook and engagement for sure. From my own experience and even from my research coming up, was a big thing, was the idea of the stress release, relieving anxiety, just coming into that sort of being in tune with yourself and that whole body learning experience, and sort of that, even that liberation, I think, too, from maybe of even everyday life, and just being able to be more open to life and just being alive, like what it is, like basically it is like what it is to be alive in my body. It kind of gives you that space and sort of gives you a channel to really become that embodied version of yourself, which in our everyday lives nowadays, like, it's maybe not, if you're sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, like you're just sitting there, you're not really in that sense. And so that is a really shift, I mean, from the way we live nowadays in our everyday sort of modern lifestyle versus what it is to be moving, to be in tune with your body, to be your full embodied self, and that whole person of who you are is just, it is really transformative and a big shift that we notice. And so, yeah, just even thinking about how you feel in a training session. I mean, you relax, you feel like, you pushed yourself, you've had that experience, you felt the energy and, even people might say like that fighting spirit, right, through your body. And just, yeah, it just really gives that sense of fulfillment at the end, which I think is transformative.
I love that answer. And I wholeheartedly agree. I think if we understand that things that we do become habits, that neurons that fire together wire together, if we habitually spend so much time externally focused into screens and work and other people, and we don't spend really any time feeling into our bodies, of course we're not going to learn to do that, and it's going to become kind of a forgotten part of ourselves. So that reintegration of the external and internal senses through martial arts, which we could just call embodiment, well, one aspect of embodiment, right? So
Exactly.
It's such a complex term, but yeah, I think that is something that's so beautiful, and you just really eloquently described, so thank you.
Oh, thank you.
If people want to check out the gender panel that you're speaking on, find out more about your work, how can they connect with you?
Yeah, for sure. So the panel right now is on martial arts studies website, so they can check out that and the program and the other fascinating papers and research going on in martial arts studies. But yeah, email is great. I'm also on social media as well, so Instagram or LinkedIn, all great platforms to connect on, where I also share some of my work.
Amazing. We'll pop all the links to those in the show notes here. Thank you so much for giving up your time, for chatting with me, and I cannot wait until we get to geek out more about gender and martial arts and embodiment on our panel.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Georgia. It's great to talk to you and can't wait to see you soon.
Thank you for being part of the club. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch, please refer to the information in the show notes. If you'd like to support this podcast, please consider leaving us a review or subscribing on whichever platforms you use to listen or watch the podcast. The Conscious Combat Club acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands in which we work, live and play. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We'd like to say thank you to Nari for the beautiful song Shape Me, heard at the beginning and end of every
Nobody
episode.
shapes me.
If you'd like to connect with Nari, you can find her on Instagram at Nari the Saga.
Don't gotta tell you what my name is, I don't gotta explain it. Walk in the room, hear a boom erupting like I'm famous. I'm here shedding shells, I'm shameless. I fear nothing, no complacence. Walk too many tight ropes with no hope, so I became this poster they hold over all the heads of trauma holders. You don't need to know my history, I move boulders. Atlas shrug, cause I lifted the weight above his shoulders. No pretense of defense, move first like chess soldiers. This goes deeper than empowerment, cause I'm the one that power it. Physical meets mental, challenge me to keep devouring. If I can't change the scenery, at least I change perspectives. No longer isolated, but elevated and selective. Darkest places become beautiful spaces. This is where rage meets patience, meets power meets gracious. Meets, we're so glad you came and the feeling is contagious. When you the walking impact of intended bad intentions. When you the manifesting of collecting all they tensions. You the soul and body hold it all and still remember. But I'm a work in progress, testament to all contenders. Forgot what it was like to have control over self. Forgot what it was like to be the one in charge. Forgot in my reflection I could see all my wealth. Forgot that with my bare hands I break all these bars, barriers and obstacles. They can't cage me, they can't chronicle all my experiences and reduce them to appearances. When I was truly beaten, gave myself clearances to fall down, mess up, and get myself back up. I'm not looking for clovers cause I don't believe in luck. Damn, you were badass, I heard them say it clearly. Why thank you very much, I know now I'm not weary of what's next for me. Cause I expect to see growth like I was planted, watered, fed, and bloomed to be. The positivity and accountability, knowing they won't step if I'm the agent of my agency. I think I found my voice again, huh? I think I found my voice again, huh? I'm not sorry, you're the end where I begin. Boundaries, I know them well, take a breath and meditate. Who is she? I know her well, now I get to open gates. 1, 2, 1, 2, I don't need your permission. And if you get uncomfortable, then use your intuition to know that I won't stay where respect is ever missing. And everything I do, that's me making decisions. It's truly underrated, the value of self-worth. Forgot that I was rich from the moment of my birth. A penny for my thoughts, no really, you can't afford it. You cannot buy my story, rewrite it, or record it. You cannot buy my story, rewrite it, or record it, huh?